In 1996, Apple Computer, struggling, directionless, years away from anything resembling its former glory, paid $429 million to acquire a small, failing company. That company had sold, over its entire 11-year existence, roughly 50,000 computers, total. For comparison, Apple itself was selling more units than that in a matter of weeks. And yet, that acquisition is the single most important business decision in Apple's entire history. Because buried inside that tiny, commercially failed company was the operating system that would become Mac OS, and the man who built it was the same person Apple had violently forced out 11 years earlier. This is the story of Next, a company that failed by every normal business measure and somehow ended up rebuilding the most valuable company on Earth.
To understand Next, you have to understand how it began, not with an idea, but with a humiliation. By 1985, Steve Jobs was chairman of Apple, the company he'd co-founded less than a decade earlier. But a power struggle with then CEO John Sculley came to a head. In a boardroom coup, Jobs was stripped of any operational authority, effectively pushed out of the company that bore his fingerprints in every product it made. On September 12, 1985, Jobs told Apple's board he was leaving to start something new. According to accounts from the time, he downplayed it, described the handful of Apple employees joining him as low level, as if this were nothing worth worrying about. It was not nothing. Several key veterans of the Macintosh and Lisa teams walked out the door with him. 4 days later, he filed the incorporation papers for a new company. He called it Next.
Jobs' pitch was ambitious, even by his standards. Next would build advanced computer workstations, specifically for higher education, a market he felt was underserved by everything currently available. The machine they eventually built, the Next computer, was unlike anything else on the market, a perfect matte black magnesium cube, advanced object-oriented software architecture, an operating system called NextStep, built on Unix, years ahead of what competitors were shipping. Jobs, being Jobs, obsessed over details most companies would never even consider. The company's factory in Fremont, California, was designed to be as visually stunning as the product itself. Robots painted specific colors, a suspended staircase, silence on the manufacturing floor. Early investment came from an unexpected source, billionaire Ross Perot, who put in $20 million and joined Next's board, drawn in after seeing a television documentary about the company. By 1988, the finished Next computer launched at a lavish event to genuine excitement in the tech world. This was, by every technical measure, one of the most advanced computers anyone had ever built.
There was just one problem. Nobody could afford it. The Next computer launched at $6,500, an enormous price for the era, especially for its target market of cash-strapped universities. Worse, there was almost no software available for it at launch, a brilliant advanced machine with barely anything you could actually run on it. Sales were dramatically below expectations. Next had built one of the most technically impressive computers of the decade, and almost nobody was buying it. Through the late 1980s and early 1990s, Next tried multiple pivots, new hardware models, price cuts, attempts to reach broader markets. None of it moved the needle enough. By 1993, the company made a drastic decision. Next stopped making hardware entirely. The Black Cube, the factory, the ambitious workstation dream, all of it abandoned. Next would now sell only its software, NextStep, trying to license it onto other companies' hardware, including Intel-based PCs. By most conventional business measures, Next had failed. A company built with extraordinary talent, extraordinary funding, and extraordinary ambition, reduced to software licensing deals, just to survive.
But here's what makes this story genuinely different from every other failed company story. While Next was failing commercially, its technology was quietly changing the world in the hands of people who actually got to use it. In 1990, a researcher at CERN named Tim Berners-Lee was given a Next computer. On that machine, he built something that had never existed before: the first web browser and the first web server in history. Tim Berners-Lee built the World Wide Web itself on a Next machine. Around the same time, a young programmer named John Carmack was using Next computers at id Software. On that platform, Carmack and his team built Wolfenstein 3D and then a little game called Doom, two titles that essentially invented the first-person shooter genre. A commercially failed computer had, almost by accident, become the machine that built the modern internet and modern gaming, more or less simultaneously.
Meanwhile, back at Apple, things had gone badly. Through the mid-1990s, Apple's own attempts to build a next-generation operating system, a project called Kotlin, had completely collapsed. Desperate, Apple went shopping for someone else's technology to rescue them. They seriously considered BeOS, built by another ex-Apple executive, Jean-Louis Gasset. But after a head-to-head technical comparison, Apple's engineers chose NextStep instead. On December 20th, 1996, Apple announced it would acquire Next for $429 million in cash plus 1.5 million shares of Apple stock. Apple didn't just get an operating system, it got Steve Jobs back, initially just as an advisor, but by mid-1997, firmly back in charge of the company that had pushed him out 12 years earlier. It's been joked, only half-jokingly, that what actually happened is Next bought Apple for negative $429 million.
What followed changed computing history. NextStep's foundation became the basis for Mac OS X, the operating system that saved Apple, and every version of Mac OS since. Next's own senior engineers didn't just hand over the technology and leave. Avi Tavananyan, Next's VP of Engineering, became Apple's Senior VP of Software. Jonathan Rubinstein, Next's VP of Hardware, became Apple's Senior VP of Hardware. Design elements from NextStep's interface, including the dock, still visible on every Mac today, trace directly back to that commercially unsuccessful black cube from 1988. Every iPhone, every iPad, every Mac sold today runs on a technical lineage that leads back to Next, a company that sold barely 50,000 machines over its entire existence, ended up as the technical foundation for one of the most valuable companies in the history of the world. So, what actually happened to Next? By nearly every normal business measure, it failed. It never achieved meaningful sales. It abandoned its own hardware within a decade. As a standalone company, Next simply didn't work. But the technology it built outlived the business failure completely, quietly powering the invention of the World Wide Web, the birth of the first-person shooter genre, and eventually, the entire rebirth of Apple itself. There's a term some historians use for companies like this: a successful failure. A business that couldn't survive on its own terms, but whose ideas mattered more than its balance sheet ever did. Steve Jobs got ousted from Apple, in humiliation, in 1985. 11 years later, the company he built out of that humiliation walked him back through the front door, carrying in its pocket the exact technology Apple needed to survive. Sometimes the real return on an idea doesn't show up on the company that built it. It shows up years later, somewhere else entirely. If you found this one interesting, next time we're covering another company whose technology mattered more than its business ever did. Subscribe so you don't miss it.